just absolutely shred them all, do his burst. Nice.
Holy shit!
Yes guys, Neuvillette is completely busted. It's probably the one thing most of us in the Genshin community can agree on when it comes to meta discussions. So Neuvillette just being able to clear stages in the Abyss or whatsoever at a level that is just higher compared to what other characters can do. But in this video I want to analyze how his strength as a character may affect how Hoyoverse will balance stuff for Genshin in the future. First of all, let's make one thing very clear. When I say that Neuvillette is busted, I mostly refer to the category of on-field carries. So I'm comparing him to characters like Hu Tao, Ayaka, Alhaitham, and such. The interesting thing is that when he's compared to these characters, Neuvillette doesn't have a very obvious numerical advantage over them. Originally, so before he came out, this is what made most of us theory crafters underestimate what Neuvillette could do in regards to the meta, because his team DPS didn't look too high compared to the top meta characters. However, since he had long rotations from the start, his damage per rotation was pretty high, and also his AoE potential was already very noticeable. Back when I made my pre-release analysis, I speculated that he could potentially compete with Xiao in terms of AoE capabilities, but honestly he ended up completely crushing the expectations. Pay attention now, because this to me is the one thing that makes Neuvillette very hard to power creep when it comes to Genshin meta. Ignore the numbers for a second now. Neuvillette has the best AoE in the game while also being extremely easy to use. When it comes to the game design of Genshin, to me having good AoE capabilities is just better than having good single target capabilities, because I feel like the boss rooms in Genshin, so the DPS checks where single target becomes really useful, are just relatively easy to clear. And the reason is that since you're facing just one opponent, the difficulties in terms of having to remember the patterns of said opponents are just lesser compared to what you have to remember when you're facing multiple waves of enemies. But there you have Neuvillette, who basically doesn't give a single fuck about any of this. Neuvillette's AoE is so good that it doesn't really have to care much about how the enemies are positioned or what you're doing in a scenario where you're facing many of them, because he will just hit most of them most of the time. Basically, as things are now in Genshin, Neuvillette is just designed to be a character that completely ignores the mechanical difficulties that come from facing groups of opponents in the Abyss, and this is just very unbalanced to me. Of course though, since he came out very recently, MiHoYo is making things extremely easy for him right now. It's honestly pretty funny because it's quite easy to spot it, but in the first side of the current Abyss, all the groups of opponents are lined up in a straight line, which makes it very easy for the horizontal AoE Neuvillette has to just hit all of them right off the bat. But frankly, it's a conveniency that it doesn't really need, because his AoE is so good and so big that even when opponents he's facing are not lined up perfectly, he will just be able to crush them very easily. This kind of flexibility in terms of gameplay is the hardest thing to power creep to me when it comes to meta in Genshin. Just think of Child National. I don't know if most of you actually know about this, but for the longest time now, the Child National teams haven't been the most impressive in terms of team DPS, they've actually been quite below average. Still, the reason the team has stayed so relevant for so long is because of how easily you can translate that damage to very good AoE results. There is a trade-off with Child National though, which is the tricky setup you need to pull off in order to enable that type of damage, and also you need to manage shielding in terms of energy, which isn't the easiest thing. Meanwhile, Neuvillette can dominate groups of opponents to an even higher degree, while also being very easy to use, and that's the second thing that sets him apart compared to the others. Aside from making sure that you're activating his passive, there is really not much to care about with Neuvillette, honestly. Mostly it's just about left click spam and then watching the enemies die, which is very satisfying, but it's almost easy to a boring degree. Even just from a numerical perspective, it is excellent for a character to be easy to play because it allows him to reach that theoretical ceiling of damage he can dish out very consistently, and this is just good. On the opposite, let's take a character like Hu Tao for example. Hu Tao is probably one of the hardest characters to master in Genshin when it comes to doing her combos perfectly. To this day, Hu Tao has a very impressive ceiling when it comes to single target damage, but this ceiling is based on an assumed realistic average of charge attacks she will be able to dish out in a single rotation. If you're not consistently able to match that average, you will be losing more than 10% rotation damage with Hu Tao specifically, and that's not very good if you're not a skilled player, I guess. In comparison, I just feel like Neuvillette is able to reach that ceiling of damage of his very consistently, which makes him good for every type of player, and that's great. It's pretty interesting actually, because if you run the numbers, teams like Ayaka Hyper, Hu Tao Hyper, Hu Tao Double Hydro haven't really fallen off in terms of the damage they can deal. So basically there hasn't really been a numerical power creep, but more so a gameplay power creep. But while for characters like Ayaka or Hu Tao, it's very easy to spot the gameplay flaws they have and how Hoyo can counter them in their base, for Neuvillette it's much harder to me. It's pretty hilarious really, because in the next base they're putting the Hydro Tolpa, who nullifies Hydro damage dealt against him, and that's quite literally the only way you can possibly counter this juggernaut named Neuvillette, honestly. The other thing I haven't talked about yet is that his damage output now with Fiorina looks extremely impressive even from a team DPS perspective, and if you look at it from a damage per rotation perspective, it's even more enormous. To be honest though, he didn't really need Fiorina to reach this type of ceiling, because with the Vape teams he already had before Fiorina came out, he already could achieve very high damage output. Fiorina just made it much more consistent for all of his teams, which is obviously great. The thing many people ignore is that in certain scenarios, damage per rotation is more valuable than damage per second, so DPR versus DPS. Sometimes people look at long rotations with skepticism because they just see them as extended rotations that aren't really better than the short rotations in terms of DPS, but while that's true, these rotations are doing more damage. For example, let's take two teams, one having a 20 seconds long rotation and the other having a 25 seconds long rotation, both of them having the same DPS. At a glance you're saying, oh, these teams are equal because they have the same DPS, but this feels very obvious to say. The second team has an additional 5 seconds long window where it can deal damage as opposed to the first. So while the first team after the first rotation is doing the setup for the second rotation, the second team will still be dealing damage, and if that damage is enough to finish the room or a wave, it's an incredible advantage that is just so practical in so many scenarios in the Abyss. Of course, long rotations aren't always very easy to handle, because characters like Xiao, for example, that play on relatively long rotations, if you're not positioning them correctly at the start, then you might end up wasting some of the potential damage by the end of the rotation. But for Neuvillette, that isn't the case, because it's just so mobile, it's just so versatile. It's also a matter of supports. He doesn't have supports that restrict him to play within a specific range, like Bennett for example, so he can just fly through the room and do his thing for 25 seconds or even longer. So not only Neuvillette's team DPS is very competitive with the meta, his damage per rotation is even more impressive, and if you combine it with all the things I said before about him, you just can see how this character is incredibly busted. Busted to a degree I just can see how they can feasibly power creep him, honestly. Like, the funny thing is that he can still improve, because if you look at his team structure, you have Neuvillette, Fiorina, and then it's up in the air. You can use Kazuha and then Zhongli in a non-healer team, but honestly, you can potentially replace Zhongli with something better offensively, even though he's providing the shield that is useful at Constellation 0 for Neuvillette, but offensively the team can still improve. Honestly, the one thing Neuvillette is missing is probably front load. He doesn't have much, but if they release a Pyro off-field character in the future that is more self-sufficient than Shenling, for example the next Pyro Archon, it could fit with Neuvillette very well, because it could enable some additional front load for the team. Through the Vapes you can potentially generate with Fiorina's Elemental Burst or Neuvillette's Elemental Skill and Burst, all of that stuff. So overall, as things currently are, Neuvillette is just a perfect character, and probably the only carry I would have in the top tier of Genshin, so alongside characters like Nahida, Fiorina, because he's just so impactful in the scope of the game. And honestly, I don't see this changing anytime soon, at least not for the next 2 or 3 years. And with this, I'm done for today. Peace.